folks. Hey, folks. Hey, folks. Hey, folks. All right, let me get into some of your questions. I'm going to jump into things today. Really interesting week that we have had here. Let me start with a bunch of questions and try and pull them together. Hey, everybody. Happy anniversary of the 19th Amendment that recognized women's right to vote in the United States of America, 1920. One of the things that the Christian radical right, the Christian nationalists, are trying to take away from us. As you probably know, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has reposted a video suggesting that women should not vote, that there should be family votes that the men in the family wield. So anyway, nice to remember it. And looks like Facebook is here, so we're good to go. I'm going to put together a bunch of the things that you all asked me about, but I do want to address what I'm picking up from the comments that you have put in the chat. And that is that people are very much on edge. They're very nervous. And there's good reason to be. I'll talk more about that and about the language of fascism that Donald Trump is using and about the deployment of troops in certain ways in certain cities in the United States. But what I really want to make sure you grasp is that this administration is enormously brittle. They are making performative attempts to look as if they are in control, but they are extraordinarily brittle. And what I mean by that is that, first of all, as you probably have gathered, Donald Trump is not in good health. You know, if you have watched any of his recent performances, which are long, you'll see that he keeps his right hand hidden. Today in a press opportunity, he kept it under the top of the desk. That's because it is very, very badly bruised, apparently from some sort of an IV line in it. I am not a doctor or a nurse, and I'm only reporting to you what I have heard, but it is clear that this is an issue for him. Sometimes he covers it with makeup. And sometimes he simply tries to hide it. But to me, the physical side of his deterioration, whether it's his hand or his badly swollen ankles, is of less note than his mental deterioration. People have said, what do you mean? He's always been, off the wall and you couldn't tell what he was saying. And I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with that. If you look at videos from him in the 1980s, he was very much on his game. You didn't have to agree with him, and maybe he wasn't, Einstein, but he was witty and he was quick and he could do an interview and he could finish a sentence. And that was already deteriorating by 2016, but he still in the 2016 campaign could hold an audience in a sort of impressionistic way. A lot of people didn't want to hear that, but it was true. And people liked to go to his rallies because they felt like they were seeing a performance kind of, and maybe the words were not in kind of the order that one would normally expect them to be, but it was kind of like watching somebody improvise on themes that you had heard before. That's gone now. He is no longer able to do much except sort of hit some themes, but they're really incoherent. And rather than playing to the crowd the way he could do even in 2016, he now basically just lists his own grievances and talks about how great he is, which is not a great way to grab an audience. So you can watch him deteriorate mentally, and also you can see that he is unable to function in the real world at this point. His reflections, for example, yesterday on the idea that that the 7 European leaders who rushed to the White House on Monday after Trump's disastrous performance with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in Alaska on August 15th, were somehow cheering him on when it was pretty clear they were trying to stabilize him and stabilize what the U.S. foreign policy would look like. He not only seemed to misunderstand what was going on there, but he also said that those 7 people represented 38 countries and that they referred to him as the president of Europe. And just to be clear, I think he is just constantly He's in such a fantasy world that he is constantly blowing larger and larger his sense of self-importance to compensate for the fact he knows how deeply unpopular he is. So again, you will also see him boast that he has solved 7 or now maybe it's 10 wars. I mean, that's all just fantasy crap that doesn't work. You're also seeing his handlers, the people around him, really encouraging him to put his time into the kinds of performances that he cares about. So he's doing a lot of remodeling, both of the White House and of the Rose Garden, which he paved to look quite a bit like Mar-a-Lago, and has put in a sound system that is the same as the one at Mar-a-Lago or similar to it. So he can play DJ on his iPad. He's talked about getting rid of the east wing of the White House and replacing it with this giant event space. We've seen him walking on the roof of the White House with an architect. Now he is talking about remodeling the Kennedy Center, and he's talking a lot about the different sort of landscaping things that he's going to do around Washington, D.C. These are not normally the concerns of a United States president. These are the concerns, it seems, of somebody whose real heart is in real estate and is getting older and incapacitated. So people are urging him to spend his time and his energy there. You're also seeing, excuse me, you're also seeing his loyalists really just over the top, exaggerating how wonderful he is in ways that are reminiscent of the sort of ways that the sycophants of somebody like the head of North Korea talks to him, and that's about soothing his ego and making him feel better than he is. So the whole reason I went into that detail is because while he is out there trying to pretend that he is a strong man or a dictator, he's actually crumbling. He's actually a very, very weak man personally and mentally. And I think there's a real attempt to shore him up by the people around him so that they can put in place some form of authoritarianism. So it won't matter if he's there any longer, because certainly if you look at J.D. Vance and how they are positioning him next to Trump or behind Trump frequently. He's doing a lot more media now. It certainly seems as if they are preparing him to step into place should he need to do that sooner rather than later. But J.D. Vance is not popular. So it's not clear how much they're going to be able to accomplish with J.D. Vance in that seat. So first of all, the head of the administration is in really poor shape. But then secondly, Trump is underwater on everything, every single one of his issues, and his own job approval rating is also in the not the wasn't the word I was looking for, the gutter, let's put it that way. It's not in good shape. His approval ratings hover. If you put them all together, there's some trackers that do it every day. They have him in the 40s at most, and that's not a good place to be this early into an administration. As I say, that is the average of all of them taken together. That's not some that show him really deeply underwater. But you can really see how concerned the White House is about where Trump's approval rating is by this sudden push to insist that America is being destroyed by crime. And this is really interesting because they're inventing a new issue that they hope he can get traction on. And it's an issue that fascists often rise to power on by saying, I'm the only person who can save you from crime. And they're really, really trying hard to hit that. So, for example, yesterday, I don't know if you were watching, but the administration had Trump sign an executive order in which he claimed that that he would insist that anybody who was caught burning a flag would automatically get a year in jail. Well, he has no power to do that. That's just not even in the purview of the president. And flag burning was protected by the U.S. Supreme Court by a 5-4 decision in 1989. But there's two things going on there, I think. One is that in his discussion of the executive order, Trump said, "Oh, everybody is burning flags. It's so terrible. This is such a terrible thing. And, we have to stop this flag burning." When was the last time you heard of anybody burning a flag? I mean, I was like, what? Flag burning? And that's really interesting because that was a really big deal in the 1980s, obviously leading to the Supreme Court decision and then the discussion of whether or not it should be protected speech after that. In many ways, Trump is reverting to the 1980s, a time when he felt like he was very powerful. At least one puff piece writer called him the King of New York City. And he clearly feels comfortable in that gaudy world of the 1980s when he appeared to be at the top of his game. But at the same time, they are clearly trying to tell the American people that there's a crisis that they are aware of that none of the rest of us are. And in the last several decades, really, violent crime especially has been plummeting around this country. And one of the caveats that Democrats keep saying is, we know we have to do better. We know we have to do better. Well, here's a news flash. We always have to do better on crime. But cities don't have any monopoly on crime. Those of us in the country will know very well. And the idea that you combat crime by turning the military against the US public is bonkers. I mean, what Trump and the administration have done is they have cut funding to anti-crime prevention programs, which have worked really well. So in Washington, D.C., for example, violent crime is at a 30-year low. And those are according to the statistics from the Department of Justice. So this is not, somebody trying to pull them out of thin air. Similarly, violent crimes in Chicago have plummeted. Now, there was a spike during COVID, but it's a little hard to read that into this entire long past when, in fact, violent crime has been dropping over the last 30 years. So you can really see Trump and especially Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff, doubling down on this idea that there's terrible, terrible, terrible crime. And to that end, you are constantly seeing Trump talking about how he has saved Washington, D.C., and now suddenly people feel able to go out, and now they can go to restaurants and so on. That is completely made up. And if you have ever spent any time in Washington, D.C., you will know it's completely made up, and that those troops are there for visibility. More than they are for actually doing anything, not least because they are not stationed in the parts of DC that have crime issues. They are stationed in the very public areas down the National Mall, for example, or close to the White House. But you're also seeing Stephen Miller, who I say sounds increasingly frantic, going on TV and talking about how terrible crime is. He said last night, and I pulled this quote because I thought it was really interesting. He said that that crime is so bad in the cities, especially in Washington, D.C., that the criminals in Washington, D.C. are working with transnational crime organizations. And then he went on to do something very interesting. And that's that he began to say that he began to equate Democrats with criminals. This is a quote. The Democrat, and that was used by Rush Limbaugh as an insult to Democrats. So they called the Democrat Party as opposed to the Democratic Party. And that's always a sign you can tell that somebody's just being a jerk. He says the Democrat Party does not fight for, care about, or represent American citizens. It is an entity devoted exclusively to the defense of hardened criminals, gangbangers, and illegal alien killers and terrorists. The Democrat Party is not a political party. It is a domestic extremist organization. And then he goes on to talk about how DC residents were afraid to go to restaurants. They were getting carjacked right and left. They were robbed and they were getting beaten. And, now suddenly there are no homicides in Washington, D.C., thanks to Donald Trump. In fact, D.C. has seen many weeks without homicides in this year alone. But and then he goes on to say, Democrats, instead of jumping up and down and saying, thank you, President Trump, thank you for saving our lives, thank you for saving our cities, thank you for scrubbing away all the graffiti, the trash, the homeless encampments, the druggies, instead of cleaning up the city, instead of thanking for that, they're saying, President Trump, how dare you save our lives? How dare you save our children? How dare you save our souls? And then he goes on to attack the Democratic Party more thoroughly. But I think what you can see there is real frustration with the fact that having put in place their ideology, that America would be better off if you got rid of undocumented immigrants, people of color, and so on, that they really thought people would like this. And the fact that white Americans, as well as those Americans being attacked, also don't like it is an issue of great frustration for Miller. And he seems to be lashing out and saying, how dare you not thank us for this? And now today, once again, Trump suggested that because of how bad crime is, people are asking him to be a dictator. And you can see him sort of trying to make sense of the argument that he should become a dictator. And yet, this is extraordinarily unpopular, and you are seeing people really pushing back against it. All right, so that's where I wanted to start today. But let me give you some more pieces of this. So one of the questions that you asked about is you asked about whether or not Trump can send the National Guard to different cities and what he is doing there. One of the things that the administration has done and continues to do is they're finding loopholes in the laws and obscuring what is really going on. So when they sent troops to LA, for example, they argued that they were only using the troops to defend federal buildings and federal officers. And that's sort of a loophole where that is an okay thing to do. But then, of course, that meant that the agents were standing with ICE agents, and that made it look as if the troops were working with the ICE agents. That is still being untangled in a trial in California. But that sort of use of, if we tie it to this and this and this, maybe we can get away with things, has been the hallmark of this administration's approach to anything legal since it took office, where they are in court repeatedly, but rather than saying, yes, by God, we have the right to do this and we're going to stand on that, they're saying things like, this is the wrong jurisdiction to argue against this, or we don't have the right paperwork, or, they're really trying to get away with stuff by obscuring it, by obfuscating it. And that actually really matters. So can Trump do this? Well, unclear on a lot of it, but it is very clear that the state governors, for the most part, do not want their National Guard troops used in the way that Trump is talking about using them, because there isn't an emergency and because they need those troops. And those troops are members of the community in their states, and they don't want to be ripped away and sent off to police another state or to police Washington, D.C. for nothing except Trump's ego. So and to establish this idea of fascism. So there is pushback there that you might not perhaps be aware of. And also somebody asked about, why are the troops doing this? Remember, they have to. You can't say, negatory good buddy, I don't feel like going off on this deployment. And they can face a court martial if they don't. So that doesn't mean they have to do things that are illegal. But as I say, a lot of this stuff is on paper anyway, at this point, a lot of it's in courts, looking like legal orders. So, the National Guard troops are in a terrible position, which is heartbreaking because they're people who have signed up to take care of their neighbors, people like you and me. So don't judge them too harshly until they actually do something that that is obviously illegal. And I'm not counting the minutes for that myself, simply because I don't think most of them want to be there anyway. All right, so if that's some of the questions that, can Trump do that? Here's one of the other things that is going on right now that you asked about and that is really important. And I'm going to add something to it that you didn't ask about that is also very important. You asked if he has the power to fire the member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Lisa Cook, the way he did last night. And the answer to that, once again, is Trump is obfuscating. That is, under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the governors can be removed for cause. And that's the only way that they described it. And historically, that has been assumed to mean malfeasance, corruption, dereliction of duty, something that has to do with their jobs. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration does is it has put into the federal housing, I forget the next two words of it, um, agency, a loyalist, a guy whose last name is Pulte, Matthew Pulte, I believe it is. And what he has been doing is he has been accusing prominent Democrats of mortgage fraud. Now, this is incredibly uncommon, but it's also something that shows up a lot in political campaigns, in opposition research. And so he accused Lisa Cook of of putting bad information down on a mortgage years ago, and has taken that to the Department of Justice, as also has been taken a similar case against um, New York Attorney General Letitia James and California Senator Adam Schiff. And, these really look trumped up. They really look like they are just a way to launch investigations and muddy the reputations of these people. In any case, although Lisa Cook has never been charged with anything, that accusation probably doesn't fall under the traditional understanding of being fired for cause. Now, here's another piece of that. I'm going to come back to this. There has been since 1935 a case law under a Supreme Court decision of 1935 that said that the President of the United States does not have the power to remove the heads of agencies that have been set up by Congress. Now, in May of this year, the Supreme Court suggested that it was going to overturn that and was going to give the president power to do that in order to gut the federal government the way that the extremists on the Supreme Court want. But when they did that, they said the Federal Reserve is different. You can go ahead and get rid of the head of the National Labor Relations Board, but you cannot get rid of the head of the Fed and the people who make up the Fed, for the simple reason that they had some historical argument that was kind of not convincing to a lot of people, including the other three justices, for why the Fed was different. But the reason that they did that is because the Federal Reserve oversees the economy of the United States of America, and it oversees monetary policy. So, and it is supposed to be completely independent because you don't want politicians messing around with that. Donald Trump desperately wants the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. And the reason he wants them to lower interest rates is because when interest rates are lower, people are more willing to borrow money. And if they're more willing to borrow money, they're more willing to spend money, and that gooses the economy. So it heats up much faster. But the problem with that, and he wants that desperately because the economy, as you know, has been really dramatically slowing down since Trump took office, in part because of the instability of everything he's doing, in part because of the tariffs, in part because he's tossing so many people out of the country, especially the agricultural workers and the housing workers. But the economy is really grinding to a halt. So he wants the Fed to lower interest rates so people will have more money. But the Fed is also very concerned about inflation because people don't want to pay a lot more money for their goods. And if you have taken a peek at the grocery stores lately, and I just got to put a plug in here for coffee, the prices are eye-popping. You're really starting to see inflation taking off from the tariffs and from the deportations. And so the Fed doesn't want to lower interest rates because it drives up inflation. Not always, but it usually drives up inflation. So Trump has been desperate to get rid of the head of the Fed, a guy named Jerome Powell, whom he appointed and then Biden reappointed, because Powell has said, listen, I'm not going to mess with the interest rates right now. And he has backed off on Powell. Do you remember when he was doing, you might have seen it on the news. The two men were in hard hats, and you might not have known who Powell was. And Trump goes, this building is running way over the amount of money it was supposed to take. And Powell, looks at him and goes, what are you talking about? And Trump goes, yeah, I just got these numbers. And Powell looks at Powell says, let me see that. And he looks at the piece of paper and he goes, you're putting in a building that was finished 5 years ago. And Trump's like, oh, well, and then he goes on to something else. But Trump was trying to set Powell up again for malfeasance of some sort to get rid of him. And when that backfired on him, he went after Lisa Cook. Now, Lisa Cook, as the one of the board of governors, she was a professor of economics and international affairs, I think it was, and then she was on the Federal Reserve Board of the Bank of Chicago, the Chicago Federal Bank. And now, I'm sorry, I'm tired, so the words aren't really going the way they normally do. And then Biden appointed her to the Federal Reserve Board in 2022. And she is the first Black woman on that board. So she was also the person who, after the last set of jobs numbers came back as bad as they did, said, hey, this might be a turning point for the economy. So last night on True Social, that's a real man's man, right? He's like, I'm this great strong man, and instead of having a conversation with somebody, I'm going to post it on social media. Anyway, on social media, he posted a letter saying he was firing her. And so the question is, and this will almost certainly go into the courts, but possibly all the way to the Supreme Court, will the Supreme Court say to him, no, you can't do this? Because they've said no to him almost never. The Supreme Court, the lower courts say no to him a lot. But if they give Trump control over the Fed, over monetary policy, as Paul Krugman put it this morning in his newsletter, we're going to look like Turkey, where authoritarian took over federal policy and they had 80% inflation. I mean, it's just not a good idea. So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in answer to your question of whether or not he can do it. And a lot of people who probably support him for things like tax cuts do not want this guy in charge of federal monetary policy. Now, there's another piece of that you didn't ask about that is also very important. And that's that those same people who care about the stability of the American economy, I mean, we all do, but those who are investors in it have got to be paying attention to the fact that Trump is taking pieces of companies. So you've asked about the fact that he has taken a 10%. It is 10 of it's 15 of something else, a 10% cut of Intel. And just to be clear, the U.S. didn't buy that. He hit them up for that in order to he was threatening the CEO with saying that he should be fired. CEO had a conversation with him, and Trump said, I think the U.S. should have 10% of your company. And he's like, cool. And so theoretically, the U.S. now owns 10% of Intel. What does that mean? Who has control of that? But more importantly, for the larger picture here, if you are an investor or an industry, somebody who cares about industry, or a business person, years, decades of screaming that any kind of regulation of business was somehow a form of socialism, and socialism is a system by which the government takes the means of production. You are literally looking at Trump taking pieces of companies. There go free markets right out the window. All of a sudden, what your business does depends on not even what a group of people want, but what this Looney Tunes guy in the White House wants. So in terms of Trump being able to cement his power and become this authoritarian, he's actually not making a lot of friends, even among the groups that should be friendly to him. That is business people, for example. And he's also offending people like those who voted for him because he promised to make IVF free. As you know, he has not only not done that, the government is now looking at stopping IVF. All right. So what else did you ask about that I can do pretty quickly here? You asked a couple of things about, I won't do everything because we have some other stuff. I can leave stuff for Thursday, but you asked about a soft secession and what Democratic governors are doing. Soft secession is a great term. It's an interesting one that it has taken on the way it has, because states have always had the ability to resist the federal government when it was doing things they don't like. Look no further than the right-wing dominated southern states that have done everything they can not to cooperate with the federal government, not least Texas, which did not want to put in a federal warning system in the region that was just so badly flooded that lost so many people because they didn't want to do what the federal government told them to do. So what you're seeing is Democrats now doing the same thing. And to some degree, they always have. States should go their own way. But this is a real crisis for the Republican states because, as you probably know, the Democratic states produce one heck of a lot more of our GDP, of our general economic growth and our economic power than do the Republican dominated states. At the same time, one of the things you're seeing now is that the Democratic states have come together repeatedly to sue the Trump administration. And they've won. They've won in court. So one of the things that is starting to play out now is that the Republican-dominated states and especially counties or districts, which did not sue over certain of the administration's decisions, are actually being hurt more by them than the Democratic-dominated states are. Similarly, because the Democratic dominated states have these larger cities and concentrate their power in the cities, you are seeing fewer cuts to medical care, for example, in Democratic dominated states than you're seeing in Republican dominated states. So there's this weird paradox where the people who voted for Donald Trump are being hurt worse than the ones who did not vote for him. And that's not going to help him going forward. Again, this real doubling down on crime is in part because of that. But with the idea that crime will terrify everybody and they will say, yes, we want a dictator. Trump, I think, has already convinced himself of that. But you are also starting to see a number of things right now that are really interesting. One is this pushback from Democratic governors. And that's, somebody said, oh, this is brand new, but it isn't. You know, remember the members of the Democratic House kept attaching Epstein amendments to so many things and requiring discussions of Epstein that House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana, Republican of Louisiana, sent everybody home for August break early because he didn't want to have to keep dealing with it. You saw Cory Booker in the Senate slowing things down. You have seen this, and you've seen a lot of states suing the Trump administration. You're seeing more and more of that now. Obviously, Gavin Newsom's trolling of Donald Trump is epic. I mean, epic as in it will end up in the history books, because what he managed to do was to hold up a mirror to what Trump was doing. And, you know, now that the radical right pundits are saying, oh, that's so unbecoming of an elected official, he's simply saying, I am literally imitating Donald Trump and you're excusing everything he's doing. It's been extremely effective. Plus, it's funny. But I find it funny, some of the memes they've come up with. But you're also seeing J.B. Pritzker, the governor from Illinois, and that's really interesting because one of the reasons that the Texas Democrats were able to walk away from the gerrymandering in Texas was because J.B. Pritzker organized it for them and found ways for them to live in Chicago for the 2 weeks and New York and Massachusetts for the weeks that it would take for them to make a statement about the Texas gerrymandering. So Pritzker is taking a much, and that was not the first thing he did. He actually had a very important speech earlier this year. I think it was in March in New Hampshire, in which he really took a stand against the Trump administration. But this very vocal opposition to what Trump is doing is stiffening a lot of spines. So one of the things that I hope to see going forward into September, when Congress is back in session, is real pressure on lawmakers at the state level to resist the demands of the Trump administration to push gerrymandering. And, you know, this is not necessarily something that even Republican legislatures want to do because they know how deeply unpopular it is. Nobody likes gerrymandering. Republicans don't like it. Independents don't like it. Democrats don't like it. And of course, the Democrats have tried to put in place at a national level the idea of independent citizen-led commissions to draw fair maps. And when they do it, it works. It works for everybody. We cease to get such extreme candidates. People feel like they're represented, and so on. Legislatures need to hear that we care about that, and that's what we want, especially the legislatures that are not jumping on board. Texas has gone ahead with its gerrymandering plan, but a number of Republican states that he has been pressuring so far have not. Ohio, Indiana, I don't know what's going on with Florida, but those are places for people really to put pressure to remind the people in those state houses that they work for us. And I'm 1,000% not talking about violence, but rather political pressure to remind people that this is a political problem, because Trump and the administration, people like Stephen Miller, would like nothing better than to see violence in the streets. Violence in the streets will play directly into their hands. A little bit of an aside on that as well. One of the things that we've been talking about now for months is the fact that it really matters that the face of the protests is older and white. That really matters, because Trump and the administration is really trying to push this idea of inner city black and brown crime that they hope that people in the suburbs will be afraid of. Here's a newsflash. Most people in the suburbs aren't afraid of people who look like me. So having older white people out there in this moment is really, really important. And that pressure in early September, I suspect, is going to go a long way to further weakening this administration. Because, as I say, things are crumbling. They're really crumbling around. I feel like they're on a very thin layer of ice, and you're already starting to hear the cracks. And I'm not saying that this is a done deal, and I'm not saying that Trump might not pull it off and turn J.D. Vance into the great dictator of the United States of America, but I'm saying that's not a done deal. All right, so what can you do? Once again, the big things: speak up politically, go to local meetings, all of them, go to state meetings, make sure your legislative officials know what you care about. Speak up about what's important to you. This "We Are America" thing appears to be taking off. I am American thing is taking off. I'm trying to get a hat, at least, that will say that. Let's articulate what we care about and what we want. And I promise you, the number of people who are going to line up behind Stephen Miller is pretty darn small if you've watched him do anything. And even on X, which is at this point a breeding ground for fascism and authoritarianism, the comments when he gets out there are overwhelmingly negative. So the speaking up, making sure people know what you care about, and in this moment, recognizing that those of us who care about preserving democracy are the people who are, first of all, conservative. We are literally conserving the Declaration of Independence that says that we are all created equal. We have a right to be treated equally before the law. We have a right to have a say in our government and to have equal access to resources like healthcare and education and so on. We are literally those people who are trying to protect what Abraham Lincoln did, and Theodore Roosevelt, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and all those people who have stood on American democracy and expanded it. And we are standing against a very small group of radical extremists who want to get rid of American democracy and turn it into, as Trump says, a dictatorship or a fascist country or an authoritarian country that looks much more like Russia or Hungary or North Korea than it does like the United States of America. So remember that, and do recognize that this is a terrifying time for sure, but that the die has not yet been cast, and that moment is still malleable. It's not over yet. So those of you who are putting comments saying, "Oh, we're all done. Oh, it's, we're in terrible trouble. Everything is over." It's not. It's really not over yet. And to the degree that you have the energy to make your voice heard, at whatever level. Somebody said, "Hey, my big thing is I return the carts at the grocery store." You know what? You're making the world a better place, and that freaking matters. Um, Whatever your role in this is, it's not lost yet, and those things that you are doing matter. So I'm going to leave you with that today, in part because I feel like everything's really choppy, and it's really hard to find a through line in the news. But the through line for me is that it feels to me, and again, that's my fuzz word because I love having documents and events and all that to point to. But it feels to me like the American people are getting their feet under them and saying, we are the same way they did in the 1850s and the 1890s and the 1930s, in the 1950s, and saying, we may not agree with each other and we may not know what the future is going to bring or even what we want from the future, but we do know we don't want that. And that is authoritarianism or a dictatorship. And if we can encapsulate that and start to move it off stage and articulate what we do want, then we can rebuild the United States to be much better than it was before Donald Trump took office. Anyway, I hope that cheers a lot of you up, to go on, and I will see you tonight. I'll write as usual tonight. Do remember that today is the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and my team put together about a 3-minute video about that. Please do share that widely, because with people like Hegseth and the right-wing Christian nationalists talking about taking women's rights away, I feel like we need to blanket the world with that. So do that if you feel the urge, and I will see you all again on Thursday. Thank you for being here.